The roses had just begun to lose their color when the boy's voice cut through the stillness of the walled garden. "Mama, is this the place where the angels live?" The woman knelt beside the fountain, her hands pressed against the stone as if she were holding herself upright against a wind no one else could feel. She did not answer. And then the second question arrived, softer than the first. The kind of question that carries the weight of everything a child has already learned not to say. "Mama, if the men come back tonight, will you still be here in the morning?" 40 feet away, beneath the iron arch that separated the rose terrace from the inner courtyard, a man in a charcoal coat stopped walking. His right hand remained inside his pocket. His left hand rested against the trunk of the nearest cypress. He did not move for a long time. Men in his line of work had heard every kind of scream a human throat could produce. But whispers like these belonged to a country he had not visited in 37 years, and he had promised himself he would never set foot there again. The wind moved through the roses. Cassiel Drovain closed his eyes. The estate sat on the northern ridge of Velmore Hollow, a district of the city that had once belonged to textile barons, and now belonged to men whose professions were not printed on business cards. Behind 12-foot walls of pale limestone, behind a wrought iron gate that opened only for vehicles whose plates had been memorized by the men who watched them, the private garden of Cassiel Drovain unfolded across 3 acres of land that most residents of the city did not know existed. The garden had been designed 90 years earlier by a Florentine architect whose name was no longer spoken because he had died in disgrace. It was divided into 4 quadrants by gravel paths that met at a central fountain carved from a single block of travertine. The northern quadrant held the roses, 237 bushes in 42 varieties, many of them imported from cuttings that had survived wars and regime changes. The eastern quadrant held the herb beds, lavender and rosemary and sage grown in patterns that followed the old monastic arrangements. The southern quadrant held the orchard, fig and quince and medlar and pomegranate. And the western quadrant held the sculpture walk, a long gravel path lined with white marble figures, every one of them a woman, every one of them carved with her face turned slightly downward, as if listening to a voice only she could hear. On any given afternoon, the garden contained no more than 4 people. The head gardener, a man named Obrecht Kaesmeyer, who had worked the grounds for 31 years, 2 apprentices who answered to him, and Cassiel Drovain himself, who walked the paths every afternoon between 4 and 5, alone, without phone, without security detail, without anyone to interrupt the 1 hour of his day in which the rest of the world was not permitted to exist. The garden had a side gate, a narrow wooden door set into the limestone wall along the service alley behind the property. The door was painted the color of old moss and had a brass plate that had long since lost its inscription. It had been kept locked every day for 40 years. Except on the afternoon of the 14th of October, when Obrecht Kaesmeyer had opened the door to receive a delivery of cypress mulch, and he had been called away to answer a phone call from his daughter, and the door had been left standing open for 11 minutes. 11 minutes was all it took. Later, Obrecht would say that he had felt the door behind him the whole time he was on the phone, the way a man feels the absence of a coat on a cold morning, and that he had almost turned back twice before his daughter had finished speaking. He did not turn back. He finished the phone call. He walked to the mulch truck. He signed the receipt. And by the time he returned to close the gate, the garden had already changed, though the gardener himself would not learn this for another half hour. Her name was Iselda Maravin, and she was 28 years old, though anyone who looked at her face that afternoon would have placed her closer to 40. She had hair the color of wet bark, cut unevenly at the shoulders because she had done it herself with a pair of kitchen scissors in a gas station bathroom 6 nights earlier. Her eyes were the kind of brown that went almost black in low light, and they moved constantly, tracking every sound, every shift of shadow, every rustle of leaves against stone. She wore a thin olive coat that had once belonged to her mother, and underneath it a pale gray sweater that had been washed so many times the cuffs had gone translucent. Her jeans were too loose, her boots were a half size too large and had been stuffed at the toes with folded newspaper. Around her neck, on a thin silver chain that had gone slightly green at the clasp, she wore a small oval locket. The locket was closed. It had been closed for 3 weeks. She had not opened it once in that time, though her left hand returned to it every few minutes, her thumb pressing against the surface as if to confirm that it was still there. Still hers. Still the one thing nobody had been able to take from her yet. Beside her, holding her right hand with a grip that had not loosened in 9 hours, was her son. His name was Torven. He was 6 years old. He had her eyes and his father's jaw, though his mother prayed every night that the resemblance would stop there. He wore a blue windbreaker that was slightly too small, a pair of brown corduroys that had been patched at the knees with iron-on squares, and a knit cap that had belonged to her younger brother 20 years earlier, before her younger brother had died in a car accident at the age of 15, before her mother had followed him into the ground 3 winters later. Torvin did not speak much. He had stopped speaking much around his 3rd birthday, after an incident involving a glass of spilled milk and a man's voice that had risen in a way that had frightened something loose inside him. He spoke now only to his mother, only in the register of questions, and only when he could not hold the question inside his chest any longer. They had entered the garden by mistake. Iselda had been walking the service alley behind the estates on the northern ridge because the alley was one of the few places in Velmore Hollow where the city's patrol cars did not pass. She had been looking for somewhere to sit down, somewhere to give Torvin the last of the bread she had bought that morning from a corner bakery, somewhere to close her eyes for 20 minutes without the sound of traffic pressing against her temples. She had seen the open wooden door. She had looked down the alley in both directions. She had seen no one, and she had stepped inside, pulling Torvin gently behind her, and she had closed the door as softly as she could, and she had turned around and she had seen the roses. She had not known that gardens like this existed. She had not known that anything like this could exist inside a city, inside a wall, inside the same country she had been walking across for 6 days. She had led Torvin along the gravel path toward the sound of water, because water meant she could wet a cloth and clean the small cut on his chin that had started bleeding again that morning, and she had not heard the footsteps on the path behind her. She had not seen the man in the charcoal coat stop walking beneath the iron arch. She had only knelt beside the fountain and pressed her hands against the stone and felt for one suspended moment the sensation of being somewhere that nobody in the world knew she was. And then Torvin had asked his first question. Counting her money that morning, she had found $4.18. 6 days ago, it had been $62. She had stopped counting the days since she had last slept lying down. 6 days earlier, on the 8th of October, Iselda Maravin had been standing at the kitchen sink of a narrow row house on Brennick Street, washing a plate that had not been dirty, because washing something was the only way she knew to keep her hands from shaking. Her husband's name was Hadrian Orsk. She had met him at 21, married him at 22, and spent the 6 years since then learning the weather patterns of a man whose moods moved through a house, the way storms moved through a valley. In the beginning, it had been words. Words sharpened to a point and aimed at the parts of her she had once been proud of. Her laugh, which he had found embarrassing in public. Her sister, who had been told to stop calling. Her job at the community college library, which he had explained was taking time away from their marriage until she had quit. The words had worked for almost 2 years. And then the words had stopped being enough. The first time he had put his hands on her, she had told herself it was an accident. The second time, she had told herself it was the alcohol. The third time, she had stopped telling herself anything. By the time Torvin was born, the pattern had settled into the walls of the house the way damp settles into wood. Hadrian would come home. The temperature of the rooms would change. Iselda would measure her voice and her movements and her expressions against a chart she kept only in her head, and some nights the measurements would be correct and the house would stay calm, and other nights the measurements would be wrong by some margin she could never predict. She had learned to keep Torvin in his bedroom during the evenings. She had learned to turn on the small fan beside his bed, not because the room was warm, but because the white noise of the blades softened the sounds from the living room into something a child might mistake for weather. On the night of the 8th, Hadrian had come home at 10:30. He had been drinking at a bar on Lumber Street. She had heard his truck pull into the driveway, and she had known from the sound of the engine cutting out too hard that the measurements would not save her tonight. She had walked to Torvin's room first. She had knelt beside his bed and whispered that she loved him, and she had turned on the fan, and she had closed the door. She had returned to the kitchen. She had begun washing the plate that was not dirty. What had happened next, she did not remember in order. She remembered the sound of the back door. She remembered the smell of whiskey. She remembered his voice rising, and the crack of a plate against the tile, and the cabinet pressing into her shoulder. And then the long quiet afterward when she was on the floor, and he was standing and the kitchen light was too bright above them both. What she did not expect was the sound of Torvin's door opening. He had come down the hallway in his blue pajamas, holding the small stuffed owl he had slept with since he was 2 years old. He had stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, and he had looked at his mother on the floor, and he had looked at his father standing over her, and he had not cried. He had not moved. He had simply stood there with the owl pressed against his chest, and he had looked at his father with an expression that Iselda had never seen on a child's face before. It was not fear. It was something older than fear. It was the expression of a small creature that has understood, for the first time, the exact shape of the world it has been born into. Hadrian had turned. He had seen the boy, and something in his face had changed in a way that Iselda had felt against her own skin before Torvin's eyes could register it. In that moment, sitting on the kitchen floor with her hand pressed to her shoulder, Iselda Maravin understood 3 things at once. She understood that Torvin would remember this night for the rest of his life. She understood that if she stayed in this house for one more night, her son would learn that this was what love was shaped like. And she understood that the emergency bag she had been packing in pieces for 11 months, hidden inside the false bottom of the laundry hamper in the upstairs closet, was not going to pack itself any tighter than it already had. She had stood up. She had walked past her husband without looking at him. She had gone up the stairs. She had retrieved the bag. She had put it in the trunk of the car whose title was in her name because his license had been suspended twice in the preceding year. She had lifted Torven from the kitchen doorway. She had walked out the front door at 11:47 at night. She had not gone back. 6 days of driving had brought her to Velmore Hollow. Somewhere on the 3rd day she had pulled into a parking lot and opened the locket around her neck and looked at the tiny photograph inside it. The photograph was of her mother. The woman who had once, in the last week of her life, whispered something Iselda had not understood at the time. Do not mistake the cage for the house, Easy. Do not teach him to live inside it. She had closed the locket. She had not opened it again. She heard the footsteps on the gravel before she saw the shadow. Iselda's body moved before her mind could catch up. She rose from the edge of the fountain and pulled Torvin behind her in a single motion, placing her own body between her son and the sound. Her left hand closed around the locket. Her right hand flattened against Torvin's chest, holding him in the narrow space between her back and the stone rim of the fountain. The man had stopped at a distance of perhaps 20 feet. He was standing very still, his palms turned open and slightly raised, in a gesture she recognized from somewhere in the deep files of her memory, a gesture people used when they wanted an animal to understand they were not about to strike. He was tall, broader across the shoulders than she had first thought. His coat was charcoal wool, unbuttoned, and underneath it she could see a dark shirt with no tie. His hair was silver at the temples and black everywhere else, cut short the way men cut their hair when they did not want other people to be able to describe them afterward. His face was the kind of face that did not move unnecessarily. Every feature of it had been composed, not arranged by nature, but composed, as if he had spent decades learning which muscles to hold still. She did not know his name. She did not need to know it. She had learned, over 6 years of marriage and 6 days of driving, how to read a man in the first half second of looking at him. And what she read in this man was something that did not match any of the categories she had built. He was not angry. He was not curious. He was not the soft, patronizing shape of concerned that men sometimes performed when they wanted something from a woman who looked broken. He was listening, not to her, to something inside himself that her son's questions had woken up. "I am going to leave," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "I am sorry. I did not know." The door was open. "We did not take anything. We are going to leave right now." The man did not answer. He did not move. He looked past her, at Torven, and his eyes stayed on the boy for a long moment. And then he looked back at her. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than she had expected, and more quiet. "Your son is bleeding." She blinked. She looked down. Torvin's chin had started bleeding again. A single line of red had traced down his jaw and stained the collar of his small blue windbreaker. She had not seen it. She had been watching the man. "I have a cloth," she said, "in my bag. I can." "The fountain water is clean," the man said. "There is a cloth on the bench under the arch. It is folded. It has not been used. If you let me, I will bring it to you." She did not answer. He did not move. He was waiting for her permission, and she understood, with the distant clarity of a woman who had not been asked for her permission about anything in 6 years, that he would not move until she gave it. "Yes," she said. He turned. He walked to the bench beneath the iron arch. He picked up a small folded white cloth from the wooden slats. He walked back and stopped at a distance of 10 feet and extended the cloth toward her on the flat of his open palm, the way a person offers something to a creature that might still run. She took it. She did not look away from him as she took it. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "You walked into my garden. You did not walk into a trap." Cassiel Dravain was 64 years old. He had been born in a country that no longer existed by the name it had carried at his birth, in a coastal town whose harbor had been destroyed twice and rebuilt once, to a mother whose maiden name had been Ilmara Vosco. He ran an organization that operated across 4 cities and 3 national borders. He had not carried a weapon on his person in 11 years because he had not needed to. His presence in a room was sufficient. He had buried 2 brothers, 1 wife, and a business partner whose grave he still visited on the 11th of every month, alone, with a single white carnation. He had not cried at any of the funerals. He had not cried since he was 14 years old. His mother, Ilmara, had been a piano teacher. She had given lessons in the front room of the small house on the coast, 6 days a week, to the children of fishermen and customs officials. She had played Schubert on Sunday evenings with the windows open because she had believed that music was a thing that belonged to the street as much as to the house that contained it. She had also, 6 nights a week, taken the blows of a man who had come home from the dock at an unpredictable hour, and she had covered the bruises with the long sleeves of the dresses she had sewn herself from fabric she could barely afford. Cassiel had been her only child. He had learned by the age of 5 the exact pitch of his father's footsteps on the wooden stairs. He had learned by the age of 7 to ask his mother a question he had never stopped asking for the rest of his life. "Mama, if the men come back tonight, will you still be here in the morning?" She had never answered the question honestly. She had always said the same thing. Of course, my heart. I will be here. I am always here. She had not been there on the morning of his 14th birthday. She had died in the night, not from the blows, the doctor had said, but from a heart that had simply given out, the way hearts give out when they have been asked to contain too much for too long. His father had left the town within the week. Cassiel had been raised from that point forward by his mother's sister, a woman named Branca who had taught him how to grow things. It was Branca who had taught him the names of the roses. It was Branca who had told him, on the evening he left at 17 to travel north, that gardens were the only places on earth where what you planted was what you got. Every other thing in the world, she had said, will betray you. The soil will not. He had built the garden at Velmore Hollow 31 years ago. He walked the paths every afternoon between 4 and 5, because the hour between 4 and 5 had been the hour when his mother had played Schubert, and he had not been able to listen to Schubert since he was 14, and the garden was the closest substitute he had been able to build. He had stopped walking under the iron arch that afternoon because the boy's second question had been, word for word, syllable for syllable, the question Cassiel Drovain had asked his own mother 44 winters earlier, standing barefoot on the cold tile of a kitchen floor in a coastal town that no longer existed by the name it had carried at his birth. He looked at Iselda Maravin pressing a folded white cloth against her son's chin beside the travertine fountain. He looked at the boy who would not let go of his mother's sleeve. He looked at the locket on the thin silver chain that had gone green at the clasp, and he noticed, because he noticed everything, that her thumb had returned to it 3 times in the last 2 minutes. And Cassiel Drovain, who had not cried since he was 14 years old, felt something move in his chest that he had not permitted to move in half a century. He did not move toward them. He waited for her to finish cleaning the blood from her son's face. And when she was finished, when she had folded the cloth and was holding it in her hand as if uncertain whether she was meant to return it, he spoke, and his voice was quieter than before. "You do not have to tell me what you are running from," he said. "I already know." She did not answer him. She could not. Her throat had closed around the sentence she had been preparing for 6 days, the careful explanation she had rehearsed in the driver's seat of the car at 3 in the morning. All of those words had become useless the moment he had said the 5 he had just said. He did not press her. He did not step closer. He stood beneath the iron arch with his arms loose at his sides, and he let the silence do what silence does when it is offered to a person who has not been offered it in years. It gives them the space to breathe. It gives them back the ownership of their own words. She felt Torvin's hand tighten around the fabric of her coat. She felt the locket against her collarbone. She felt for the first time in 6 days the strange sensation of not being pursued. "I do not know who you are," she said at last. "No," Cassiel said, "you do not." "Are you going to make us leave?" "There is a side gate," he said. "The one you came through. It is still open. If you walk back to it now, I will not follow you. I will not call anyone. I will not have anyone watch you walk away. I will stand here until you are gone." She stared at him. She had not expected that. In every scenario she had imagined in the last 6 days, the offer of help had always come with a seam, a look that lingered a half-second too long, a question about where her husband was. She had become, over the course of her marriage, an expert reader of seams, and she could not find one on this man's offer. "That is the first door," he said. "There is a second." She waited. "There is a bench behind you. If you sit on it, I will have a meal brought to you from the house. You will eat it in the garden. You will not come inside. No one will speak to you except the woman who brings the tray, and she will not ask you anything. When you have finished eating, you will tell me whether you would like to hear about a third door, or whether you would like to walk back to the side gate. There is no wrong choice." Iselda looked down at her son. Torvin was looking up at her. His small face was still marked with the pale ghost of dried blood along his jaw. She knelt down to his level. "Are you hungry, baby?" He nodded. "Do you want to sit on the bench?" He looked at the man in the charcoal coat. He looked back at his mother. "Is he the kind of man who gets angry?" She felt the question land in her chest the way a bird lands on a branch that has been waiting for it for a long time. She looked at Cassiel. Cassiel had heard the question. His face did not move. He waited, and he did not try to answer the question himself, because he understood that the question had not been addressed to him. "I do not think so," she said to her son. "But if he is, we will leave. I promise you." Torvin considered this. Then he walked to the bench, and he climbed onto it, and he sat down with his small hands folded in his lap the way she had taught him to sit in places where he was not sure he was welcome. Iselda followed him. She sat beside him. She did not take her eyes off Cassiel. Cassiel took a single step backward, and then he turned his head slightly and spoke over his shoulder. "Noah." A woman had appeared beneath the iron arch. Iselda had not seen her approach. She was perhaps 50 years old, small, wearing a dark apron over a gray dress. She did not look at Iselda with curiosity. She did not look at her at all, in fact, which Iselda recognized after a moment as a kindness. "2 bowls of the white bean soup," Cassiel said. "Bread, pear slices, warm milk for the boy, water for the mother." Noah inclined her head and disappeared. When the tray arrived and Noah had placed it down and withdrawn without a sound, Cassiel spoke one final sentence before the silence settled again. "I will not ask you to tell me anything," he said. "But if you choose to speak, I will listen. And when you are finished speaking, I will tell you something I have never told anyone who is still alive." She looked at him then, fully, for the first time. She saw the silver at his temples. She saw the quiet at the center of his face. It had been the face of a man who had once been a child in a kitchen, listening to a question exactly like the one her son had just asked. "You belong here now," he said quietly. "Not as a possession. As a person who has found a place where no one is going to hurt her. That is all I mean by it. Nothing more." They ate slowly. Torvin finished his soup first, the way children do, tipping the bowl and drinking the last of the broth with both hands wrapped around the rim. He ate 3 pear slices. He drank both glasses of the warm milk. He did not speak. He sat afterward with his head resting against his mother's side, the exhaustion of 6 days finally catching up with his small body in the presence of food that had stayed in his stomach. Iselda ate more slowly. She had been eating so little for so long that her body had forgotten how to accept a full meal. She set the spoon down. She wrapped the remaining bread in a napkin without thinking, a habit she had developed over 6 days of never knowing when the next meal would arrive. She saw Cassiel notice. He said nothing. He understood that the wrapping of the bread was not about the bread. It was about the architecture of a woman who had learned that the future was not to be trusted. After a long time, she spoke. "His name is Hadrian. I married him when I was 22. I did not know then what I know now. I had grown up in a house where my father was quiet in a way that I had mistaken for safety, and I did not have the instruments to measure the difference between a man who is quiet because he is at peace and a man who is quiet because he is storing up." Cassiel did not move. He did not interrupt. She continued. "It was words first. He took apart the parts of me I used to be proud of. My laugh, my sister, my job at the library. He did it so slowly that I only noticed years later, when I looked at a photograph of myself from before the wedding and could not recognize the woman in the photograph. And then the words were not enough for him. And then it was his hands. And then it was his hands in front of Torven. That was the night I left. 6 nights ago." She paused. "I have $4.18, she said. "I have a locket that belonged to my mother. I have a son who has stopped speaking to anyone except me, and who still flinches when a cabinet door closes too loudly. My sister has not been allowed to speak to me in 4 years. My mother is dead. My father left when I was 9. I have no one. She pressed her hand against the locket. He has filed a report, she said. He called the police the morning after I left. He told them I had taken Torvin without his consent. He told them I have been hospitalized twice for mental instability, which is true, except that the hospitalizations were for injuries he put on my body. There is a warrant out for me now, for parental abduction. If a patrol car sees my license plate, they will take Torvin from me, and they will send him back to that house. And he will learn what I learned, which is that love is a thing that comes with a price, and that the price is silence. She stopped. She was not crying. She had not cried in 6 days. Cassiel looked at her for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was different than it had been before. It was lower. It was older. My mother's name was Ilmara, he said. She taught piano. She played Schubert on Sunday evenings with the windows open because she believed music belonged to the street. 6 nights a week my father came home and used her body to put down whatever had happened to him at the dock. She covered the bruises with long sleeves. She told me every morning that she had slept well. On the morning of my 14th birthday, she was not there when I came downstairs. She had died in the night. I have not listened to Schubert in 50 years. I built this garden for her. I walk it every afternoon at the hour she used to play. Your son asked the question I used to ask. He used the same words. I heard them today, in my own garden, from a child who is holding his mother's sleeve the way I used to hold my mother's sleeve. He paused. He looked at Torven, asleep against his mother's side. I am not going to let him grow up asking that question, Cassiel said. I am going to make a phone call. When I make this phone call, you will have a place to stay tonight that is not a car. You will have a lawyer by tomorrow morning who does not lose cases of this shape. The warrant for your arrest will become, within a matter of days, a warrant for his. The house on Brennick Street will no longer be a place you have to fear returning to, because he will no longer be in it. I will not tell you how that last piece will happen. You do not need to know. Iselda stared at him. You do not know me, she said. No, he said. I do not. Then why? He looked at the fountain. Because nobody did it for her, he said. And I have been walking this garden every afternoon for 31 years waiting for someone to ask me a question I could answer. Your son asked it today. The door you came through will stay unlocked for as long as you want to use it. You are a person who walked into a garden, and the garden remembered what it was built for. He did not take out his phone in front of her. He walked 10 paces down the gravel path, stopped beside the sculpture walk, and made the call out of earshot. She watched him from the bench. She could only see the line of his shoulders, the way his free hand rested against the base of a marble figure whose face was turned slightly downward. The call lasted 4 minutes. When he returned, he did not sit. He stood at a distance that allowed her to remain the larger presence at the bench, and he spoke without ceremony. There is a woman named Reniska Vaudel, he said. She is a family attorney. She practices in this city. She has handled cases of this shape for 19 years. She does not advertise. She is expecting your call at 9 in the morning. I have not told her your name. I have told her only that a woman will call, and that the call will involve a parental abduction warrant filed in bad faith, a pattern of documented abuse that was mislabeled in hospital intake records, and a child who is currently silent outside of his mother's presence. She will know what to do with that. Iselda nodded slowly. There is a building, Cassiel continued, on Murdoch Lane. It is 6 blocks from here. The top floor is a set of 3 apartments that I own under a name that is not mine. The apartment at the end of the hall has 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a bath, and a door that has 3 locks. The windows look out onto a courtyard with a single fig tree. The rent is paid. It has been paid for a year. Tonight there is a bed made up in each of the bedrooms. There is food in the refrigerator. There is a key on the kitchen counter. You will not see me there. I will not come to the building. No one who works for me will come to the building either, with the single exception of Noah, who will deliver groceries once a week and leave them at the door without knocking. You will not be watched. You will not be checked on. You will be left alone. I cannot, Iselda said. Her voice came out thin. I cannot accept. He looked at her. He did not argue. I am not asking you to accept anything, he said. I am telling you what exists. The apartment exists. The attorney exists. The side gate exists. The car you came in exists. Each of these things is a door. You will decide which door you walk through. If you walk through the side gate tonight and drive out of this city, and I never learn where you went, that is a choice I will respect. You do not owe me the choice I would prefer. You only owe yourself the one you can live inside. She looked down at Torven. He had not woken. His breathing had deepened. She thought about the car. She thought about the back seat. She thought about the radiator that had started leaking on the morning of the 4th day. She thought about the locket. She thought about her mother. Do not mistake the cage for the house. I will take the apartment, she said. For tonight. Only for tonight. That is a good way to decide it, Cassiel said. One night at a time is the only way anyone decides anything that matters. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He withdrew a small folded paper. He placed it on the bench at the far end. Noah will drive you, he said. She will take you to the building. She will walk you to the apartment, and she will leave. The paper has the address. The keys are on the counter inside. My name is not on anything. Yours will not be either. Iselda picked up the paper. She held it against her palm the way she might have held a bird that had flown into her hand by accident. Cassiel took one more step back. The attorney will ask you tomorrow whether you want the warrant dismissed quietly or whether you want the full weight of the evidence used in a way that ends him. That is your decision. Whatever you choose, it will be the right choice. There is no version of this where you have chosen wrong. The apartment on Murdoch Lane had 3 locks, a deadbolt, a chain, a small brass slide bolt near the floor that she had not expected. The kind of lock a person installs when they have understood that fear does not always enter a room at standing height. Noah had walked them up the stairs. She had not spoken. She had put away the groceries with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had done this many times before, and she had placed a small card on the counter with a single phone number written on it, and she had left. Iselda had closed the door behind her. She had turned the deadbolt. She had slid the chain. She had knelt down and pressed the small brass slide bolt into place near the floor, and then she had stayed there, on her knees, with her forehead resting against the painted wood of the door, for a length of time she did not measure. The wood was cool against her skin. She could feel the faint vibration of the building around her, the hum of a refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of a city that was moving on with its evening without any idea that a woman and a boy had just crossed a threshold that would divide their lives into a before and an after. Torven had woken briefly in the car and had fallen asleep again against her shoulder the moment she had carried him through the door of the apartment. She carried him now, still sleeping, to the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. She laid him on the bed. She removed his shoes. She tucked the blanket around his small body and watched him for a moment. She kissed his forehead. She whispered that she loved him. She walked out of the room and left the door open because he had slept with an open door for 3 years. She went into the kitchen. She sat down at the small wooden table. She looked at the refrigerator. The refrigerator was humming. She looked at the window. The window looked out on a courtyard with a single fig tree. A small string of bulbs had been strung along one of the lower branches, the kind of lights people hang during long winter evenings, and somebody had turned them on. She did not know who had turned them on. It did not matter. She looked at her own hands on the table. They were trembling in a way she had not noticed until this moment. She turned them over, palm up, and studied them as if they belonged to someone else. These were the hands that had braided her son's hair every morning for 6 days in the back seat of a car. These were the hands that had counted $4.18 into the same careful column twice that afternoon, because she had not trusted the first count. She put her face in her hands, and she began to cry. It was not the quiet crying she had permitted herself in the back seat of the car at 3 in the morning. It was not the tight, controlled crying she had allowed in the shower the last time she had been home. It was the crying of a body that had been holding its own weight for 6 years without relief, and had finally been set down. She cried until her ribs hurt. She cried until her hands were wet. She cried until the sound of it surprised her, because she had not known she could still make a sound like that. She did not hear the door of the small bedroom open. She only became aware of him when he climbed onto the chair beside her, and she felt the weight of a small body settle against her arm. Torvin was holding the stuffed owl that had been in her emergency bag, the one he had slept with every night of the last 6 days. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he lifted the owl and placed it carefully in her lap. "Mama?" he said. It was the first time in 5 days that he had said her name out loud. He leaned his small head against her arm. "It is not for me tonight," he said. "It is for you." She could not answer him. She put her arm around his small shoulders and she pulled him against her side, and she held him. And she did not try to stop the crying, and she did not try to hide it from him. Because for the first time in his life, there was nothing in the room that her tears could summon. No footsteps coming up a staircase, no door about to open. There was only the fig tree outside the window, and the hum of the refrigerator, and the soft weight of a small owl in her lap, and a boy who had chosen, in the quiet of a strange apartment, to lend her the one thing he had been holding onto for 6 days. The first phone call with Reniska Vaudel lasted an hour and 40 minutes. The second one lasted 20 minutes. The third one, 3 days later, lasted 6. By the end of the first week, Reniska had filed an emergency motion to dismiss the parental abduction warrant, supported by 4 separate pieces of evidence that Iselda had not known she possessed. A photograph her sister had taken of a bruise on her upper arm 2 years earlier, before Hadrian had cut off contact. A set of medical records from the second hospitalization, which a nurse had flagged at the time with a note in the margin that had never been acted upon. A neighbor's written statement describing sounds she had heard through the shared wall, and a recording Iselda had made on her own phone 7 months earlier, which she had forgotten she had ever taken. By the end of the second week, the warrant had been withdrawn. By the end of the third, a new warrant had been issued. This one was not for her. Reniska had not asked Iselda which of the 2 paths she had wanted to walk. Reniska had simply said, on the morning of the first phone call, that there was a piece of information that had come to her from a source she was not at liberty to name. The source had indicated that additional evidence regarding the subject of the new warrant would become available in due course, through channels Iselda did not need to concern herself with. Iselda had not asked for clarification. She had understood. On a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week, Reniska had called to inform her that Hadrian Orsk had been taken into custody at his place of employment. On a Friday in the 6th week, Iselda had sat in a small conference room in a building downtown and signed a stack of papers because Reniska had placed her own hand on the papers and said, in a voice that had carried a quality Iselda had only heard once before, "You do not need to read them. I have read them. You are signing a sentence that begins with the word free." A woman from the Child Welfare Office had visited the apartment on Murdoch Lane in the 5th week. She had sat at the kitchen table. She had watched Torvin build a small structure out of wooden blocks on the rug. She had asked Iselda 3 questions. She had closed her folder. She had said, out loud, the sentence that Iselda had not known she had been waiting 6 years to hear. Your son is safe in your care. He was not safe in the house you left. The state has no further interest in this family except its continued well-being. Iselda had closed the door behind her. She had turned the deadbolt. She had slid the chain. She had pressed the small brass slide bolt near the floor, and she had sat down on the kitchen floor beside the fig tree window and laughed once, a short, sharp laugh, because she had not known what else her body was supposed to do with the sound that had risen in her chest. Cassiel did not visit. He did not call. Noah delivered the groceries on Tuesday mornings and left them at the door. On the third Tuesday, Iselda found, among the groceries, a small paper bag containing 3 cuttings from a rose bush, wrapped in damp cloth, with a handwritten note. The note said only, "For the window if you want them." There was no name on the note. She had planted the cuttings in 3 small pots on the windowsill above the sink. They had taken root by the 5th week. By the 7th, the first green shoots had appeared. She had not told Cassiel. She did not know how to tell him. She thought sometimes that he already knew. It was the afternoon of the 7th of February, 4 months after the 14th of October, when Iselda Maravin walked through the side gate of the garden at Velmore Hollow for the 2nd time in her life. She had written to Obrecht Kesmir the week before. The letter had been short. She had asked whether the door would be open on the 7th at 3:30. He had written back a single line. It will be open. She brought Torvin with her. He was wearing a new blue coat, properly sized this time, and a knit cap she had bought for him at a small shop on the street where they now lived. He was holding her hand, but his grip was not the grip of 9 hours without release. It was the grip of a child who is curious, who is asking questions out loud in complete sentences about the shapes of the leaves. He had started speaking again in the 9th week. A therapist whom Reniska had recommended had worked with him every Thursday, and somewhere between the 8th Thursday and the 9th, the boy had begun to use words with people who were not his mother. He still flinched at certain sounds. He still slept with the stuffed owl, but he spoke. The garden was different in February. The roses were pruned down to knuckles of brown wood. The fig trees in the orchard were bare. The fountain was silent. But the paths had been swept, and the limestone walls caught the late afternoon light in a way that made the whole space feel, somehow, not smaller, but more deeply held. Cassiel was not at the fountain. He was standing beneath the iron arch, in the same charcoal coat, his hands in his pockets. He did not walk toward them. He waited. Torvin saw him first. "Is that the man with the garden?" he asked. "Yes, baby. Can I say hello? You can say whatever you want." Torvin walked across the gravel path on his own. He stopped at a distance of perhaps 8 feet from Cassiel, the kind of distance children choose when they are measuring a person for themselves. "Thank you for the roses," he said. Cassiel did not speak for a long moment. Then he bent down all the way until he was on one knee on the gravel path, and his eyes were level with the eyes of the boy. "You are welcome," he said. "How are they doing? The roses. They are growing. One of them has a leaf shaped like a heart. That is a good sign." Torvin considered this with great seriousness. "Mister?" he said. "Yes. Are you the kind of man who gets angry?" Cassiel did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was softer than Iselda had ever heard it. "I used to be," he said. "A long time ago. I have worked very hard not to be. I do not think I am today." Torvin nodded. "That is what I thought," he said. He turned and walked back to his mother. He took her hand. He leaned against her leg. Iselda looked at Cassiel, who was still kneeling on the gravel. She saw something in his face that she had not seen in October. Not softness. Something older than softness. Something like the look of a man who had watched a door open in a hallway he had walled off 50 years earlier and had found, on the other side of it, a room he had not known was still there. She reached into her pocket. She withdrew a small object wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. She walked to him. She knelt in front of him. She placed the package in his hand. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside the paper was a small framed drawing. It had been made in colored pencil. It showed 3 figures standing beside a fig tree in a courtyard. A woman, a small boy, a tall man in a dark coat, standing at a respectful distance, one hand raised in a gesture that was not quite a wave. Above the drawing, in the careful, uneven letters of a 6-year-old, a single word had been written: home. Cassiel did not speak. He held the drawing in both hands. His shoulders rose and fell once, slowly, in a way Iselda knew, without needing to be told, was a breath he had been holding for 44 years. "I cannot keep this," he said at last. "It belongs to the garden. I would like to hang it in the small room beside the fountain. If you allow it." Iselda nodded. "Then that is where it goes," she said. They stood. "There is something I want to say," he said. "There is a woman in a kitchen in a coastal town that does not exist by that name anymore. She was a piano teacher. She played Schubert on Sunday evenings with the windows open. She died on the morning of my 14th birthday, and for 50 years I have been walking this garden at the hour she used to play. I think I can listen to Schubert again now. I think I might try. This Sunday. That is because of your son. That is because of you. I wanted you to know." Iselda did not answer him with words. She stepped forward. She placed her hand briefly on the sleeve of his coat. Once, lightly, the way a person places a hand on a door that has been closed for a very long time. Then she took Torvin's hand. They walked back through the side gate. Obrecht was standing in the alley, nodding once as they passed. Somewhere in the apartment on Murdoch Lane, 3 small rose cuttings in 3 small pots on a windowsill above the sink were pushing new leaves toward the winter light. And a man in a charcoal coat walked slowly back through his garden, carrying a framed drawing, and did not, for the first time in half a century, walk alone.